The door slammed so hard the frost fell off the eaves. It was November 14th, 1977. The temperature in Hardin County, Iowa had dropped to 9 degrees overnight, and the ground was iron. A man named Eldon Marsh stood in the gravel lot of the Kellerton Grain Co-Op, his breath coming out in hard white clouds, his jaw set tight as a rusted bolt. He had driven 41 minutes in the dark in a 1966 GMC pickup with a cracked heater core, hauling 2,200 bushels of corn on a borrowed wagon, and the man behind the glass window had just slid a rejection slip under the partition like Eldon was a nobody. Like he was nothing. The slip said moisture content non-compliant, load rejected. Eldon Marsh read it twice, then he folded it in half, put it in his breast pocket, walked back to his truck, and instead of going home to his wife and 3 kids and an empty checking account, he sat in that frozen cab for 11 minutes and made a decision that would change everything. Don't go anywhere, because what happened next over the following 16 months is one of the greatest quiet comebacks in the history of American agriculture. Let me tell you about Hardin County, Iowa in the autumn of 1977. This was farm country the way farm country is supposed to look, flat and vast and humbling, like the land itself was reminding you how small you were. October had burned the fields gold, and November had come through like a sheriff, stripping everything bare. The cottonwood trees along the Boone River bottom had gone gray and rattling. The sky most mornings was the color of old pewter. Hardin County had been corn country since before the Civil War, good black glacial soil, deep and rich, the kind of ground that farmers in other parts of the country would weep over. By 1977, there were 412 farming operations still active in the county. That number had been shrinking every decade. The small farmers, the ones with 300 acres or less, were getting squeezed from every direction. Feed costs were up. Equipment prices were up. Interest rates were climbing towards something that would become catastrophic by 1980, and the grain elevators, the co-ops, and private buyers had started getting selective, very selective. The Kellerton Grain Co-Op sat at the junction of Highway 65 and a county road the locals called Miller's Lane. It was a complex of 5 white steel bins, a corrugated receiving shed, a scale platform that could hold a full semi-load, and an office the size of a large closet. The man who ran it was a fellow named Dale Pruitt, and we'll come back to him shortly. The smell of a grain elevator in November is something particular. It's dust and mildew and something sweet and slightly rot underneath, like a bread loaf left in a warm car. The whole complex hummed faintly from the auger motors and the aeration fans running around the clock. The gravel was stained with decades of corn chaff and diesel drips and boot tracks. In the morning before the trucks lined up, you could hear the sparrows going through the spilled grain at the base of the bins. This is where Eldon Marsh came, hat in hand, every November, and this is where, in 1977, the door finally closed on him. Let me tell you about Eldon Marsh. He was 43 years old in 1977. Medium height, with the kind of thick hands that come from 30 years of physical work, started young. His father had farmed 160 acres outside of Ackley, Iowa, and Eldon had been driving a tractor by the time he was 11, standing on the platform because his legs weren't long enough to reach the seat properly. He'd married his wife, Ruth Ann, in 1959 when they were both 25, and together they'd scraped together enough to buy a 280-acre parcel about 7 miles east of Eldora. They paid $180 an acre for it, put every dollar they had down, financed the rest through a federal land bank loan at 6.5%. Eldon was not a complainer. He was the kind of man who fixed things with wire and ingenuity before he'd spend money on a new part. His combine was a 1968 International Harvester 403, a machine that was already 9 years old and had seen its share of hard harvests. He kept it running with a combination of genuine IH parts, second-hand components from the salvage yard in Iowa Falls, and an almost mechanical intuition about what a machine sounded like when it was happy versus when it was getting ready to fail. He raised corn primarily DeKalb brand seed hybrid varieties, about 60 acres of soybeans. He ran a small cow-calf operation on the back 40. He didn't owe much money by farming standards, but what he owed mattered because the margin was thin as paper. A bad year didn't just mean belt tightening. A bad year meant talking to the bank. The 1977 corn crop had been a strange one. Spring planting went beautifully. The summer rains hit at all the right times. By late August, the ears were heavy and the stalks were standing clean. But then September was wet, relentlessly, stubbornly wet, and the corn came off the field at 22 to 24% moisture. The standard for elevator acceptance was 15.5%. Anything above that and the elevator charged a steep drying fee or refused the load outright. Eldon knew his corn was wet. He wasn't a fool. But he'd taken his samples to the co-op 2 weeks before, and Dale Pruitt's moisture meter had read 18.3%, acceptable with a fee, Pruitt had told him. Bring it in, we'll dock you for the drying. Eldon had planned his harvest window around that conversation. What he didn't know was that the meter had been recalibrated, or rather, miscalibrated, in the 2 weeks between that conversation and the day he hauled his load to town. The slip said 23.7%. The load was rejected. The trip was wasted. And here is what I want you to understand about Eldon Marsh. He did not argue. He did not make a scene. He folded that slip in his pocket and went back to his truck because he was a man who understood that anger was expensive and patience was capital. He just needed time to figure out what to use it for. Now let me tell you about Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt was 49 years old and had been managing the Kellerton Grain Co-Op since 1968. He was the son of a Hardin County banker, which meant he had grown up comfortable in a county where comfortable was unusual. He wore insulated Carhartt coveralls in the winter, the clean kind, the kind that had never been near an actual repair job, and a feed company cap that sat perfectly level on his head, no sweat stains, no grease marks. Dale Pruitt was not an evil man, to be precise about it. But he was the particular kind of bureaucrat who had discovered that petty authority felt very much like real power, and he had leaned into it for nearly a decade. He was the one who set the moisture cutoffs. He was the one who decided when to accept marginal loads and when to reject them. He was the one who got on the phone with the bigger farmers, the 700-acre operations, the families who'd been here since the 1890s and made accommodations. A slightly high moisture reading? Well, let's look at the relationship we have and we'll work something out. For Eldon Marsh, no such accommodation existed. Part of it was history. Eldon had once, politely, quietly, asked the county extension office to look into the co-op's weighing practices after he'd had 2 loads come back light on the scale. Nothing had come of it, but Pruitt had heard about the inquiry. Small counties have long memories. Dale Pruitt was also, by 1977, in business with a man named Gerald Foss, a large acreage farmer and part-time equipment dealer who ran 900 acres north of Eldon. Foss had money, connections, and a personality that filled whatever room he walked into. He was handsome in the beefy, well-fed way of a man who has always had enough to eat. He drove a new 1977 Chevrolet Silverado, bought his wife a Lincoln Continental that year, and wore boots with actual stitching on the toe. Gerald Foss thought very little of farmers who ran less than 500 acres. He said more than once at the feed store at the diner on Main Street in Eldora that small farmers were like old horses, sentimental to look at, but not worth the feed. Dale Pruitt laughed at that line every time he heard it. These two men, Pruitt behind his glass window, Foss at the diner table, formed a kind of casual gravity in Hardin County. Not a conspiracy, not a cabal. Just 2 comfortable men who benefited from things staying exactly as they were and who did not lose sleep over the men who suffered when things stayed that way. Eldon Marsh, sitting in his frozen truck that November morning, was invisible to both of them. Which, as it turned out, was the greatest advantage Eldon had. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated in public by someone who had just enough power to do it? Not enough power to matter, really, just enough to make you feel small in front of people who were watching. That's what happened to Eldon Marsh at the Kellerton Co-op that morning, and it didn't stop at the rejection slip. When Eldon went back to the window to ask, quietly, if there was any reconsideration available, if perhaps there was a corrected reading possible, given that the pre-harvest sample had shown 18.3%, Dale Pruitt didn't even look up from his paperwork for a full 4 seconds. That pause was deliberate. Eldon had been in enough offices to know a deliberate pause. Meter says what it says, Pruitt told him. 23.7 is 23.7. You want to contest the reading, you can fill out a formal dispute form. Takes about 3 weeks to process. 3 weeks, the wagon was already loaded. The corn needed to move. At this precise moment, as if cued by some unkind universe, Gerald Foss pulled into the lot with a fully loaded International Lodestar 1975 model hauling grain under a tarp. He hopped out of the cab and walked to the scale office with the easy confidence of a man who has never been turned away from anything. He saw Eldon's wagon. He saw Eldon's face. He put it together quickly. "Wet corn, Marsh," he called across the lot, loud enough for the two other farmers waiting in line to hear. Eldon said nothing. "That's the problem with small operations," Foss continued, unzipping his jacket because apparently it wasn't cold enough to bother him. "Can't afford the right drying equipment, end up hauling garbage to market and wondering why nobody wants it." He laughed. A man getting out of a pickup 2 spots back laughed politely too, the way people laugh when someone with power makes a joke, whether it's funny or not. "You know what you should do, Marsh," Foss said, in a tone that made it clear he didn't actually care what Eldon should do. "Sell that land to someone who can work it right. I'd give you fair market value." He said the acreage price he had in mind. It was $210 an acre, which was below what the land would bring from anyone else, and Foss knew it. It was an insult dressed as a favor. Eldon Marsh looked at Gerald Foss for a long moment. Then he looked at his wagon. Then he looked at the rejection slip in his hand. He folded it again, put it back in his pocket, got in his truck, and drove those 2,200 bushels of corn, worth approximately $4,180 at the day's market price, back down Highway 65 toward his farm 7 miles east. By the time he pulled into his own driveway, something had shifted in him. Ruth Ann saw it the moment he walked through the kitchen door. She later told her daughter that it wasn't anger on Eldon's face. It was calculation. It was the look he got when he was solving a mechanical problem, quiet, focused, slightly dangerous. "What happened?" she asked. "They don't want our corn," he said, "so we're going to do something else with it." He poured himself a cup of coffee and went out to the big barn. Here is where the story turns and where I need to tell you about something most people today have never heard of: on-farm grain processing. In the 1970s, a quiet revolution was beginning in the agricultural press that most farmers weren't reading closely enough. The Farm Journal, the Prairie Farmer, Successful Farming, buried in their back pages, between the seed ads and the equipment classifieds, were articles about a concept that had existed for 100 years but was being rediscovered with new machinery. The idea that a farmer didn't have to sell raw grain. He could do something to it first. Eldon Marsh had been reading those articles. He had been reading them for 3 years, actually, ever since a hard year in 1974 had made him start thinking about where the real money in grain went, and the answer was always the same. It went to the people between the farmer and the final user, the elevator, the processor, the feed mill. In the big red barn on Eldon's property, a 1940s-era structure with a gambrel roof and solid oak post framing that his father-in-law had helped him reside in 1965, there was a piece of equipment that most of Hardin County had written off as an eccentric purchase. It was a roller mill. Specifically, it was a used Roskamp Champion Series 4 roller mill, a commercial-grade machine originally designed for feed processing operations. Eldon had bought it secondhand from a closed feed mill in Webster City in the spring of 1975 for $1,400. He'd hauled it home on a flatbed, rebuilt the bearing housings himself, machined a new drive pulley at a friend's shop in Eldora, and spent 2 weekends getting it aligned and running. His neighbors thought it was another one of Eldon's projects, the kind of thing he tinkered with between real work. Dale Pruitt, who heard about it from someone at the implement dealer, apparently said something to the effect of Marsh bought himself a very expensive paperweight. But here is what Eldon knew that Dale Pruitt did not. Within 15 miles of his barn, there were 11 dairy operations and 22 hog confinements. These operations bought ground feed, rolled corn, primarily from a commercial feed mill in Iowa Falls. The mill charged them $2.85 per hundredweight to grind corn that the farmers themselves had sometimes grown, then sold to an elevator, which sold it to the mill, which ground it and sold it back. The farmers were paying for 4 middlemen when they could be buying from one, a neighbor who could deliver fresh rolled corn within a day of grinding. Eldon had been having conversations, quiet conversations, the kind he didn't mention at the diner. Over the previous 2 years, he'd talked to 9 of those livestock operators, not pitching anything yet, just asking questions. What were they paying? How reliable was the mill's delivery? What did the feed look like when it arrived? Was it dusty? Was it bridging in the feeders? The answers were consistently, helpfully, frustrating for the mill and illuminating for Eldon. The Iowa Falls feed mill delivered every 2 weeks. Farmers had to order in large quantities to meet minimums. The product was fine but not fresh. There had been clumping issues in humid summers. Fresh rolled corn, rolled within 48 hours of feeding, was demonstrably better for feed conversion in hogs. The oils hadn't oxidized. The starch was more available. Eldon had read the university extension studies on this. Iowa State's Animal Science Department had published data in 1973 showing 6–8% better feed efficiency in finishing hogs fed fresh rolled versus long-stored ground corn. 6 to 8% in a confinement operation finishing 800 hogs, that was real money. Now he had 2,200 bushels of corn sitting in a wagon, corn the elevator didn't want. But the corn wasn't bad, it was wet, not spoiled. And a roller mill doesn't care about moisture content. You're not storing it, you're rolling it and delivering it within 2 days. Eldon Marsh walked around his roller mill in the barn that November evening. He checked the belt tension. He started the motor, a 15-horsepower Baldur electric he'd wired to the barn panel himself, and listened to it run. He adjusted the gap between the rollers to produce the crack diameter the hog operators had described they preferred. Then he drove to his neighbor Harlan Beamer's place, 340-acre hog operation, 4 miles east. He knocked on the door at 6:30 p.m. "Harlan," he said, "I've got 2,200 bushels I can roll fresh and deliver this week. I'll beat your mill price by 30 cents a hundredweight and deliver within 2 days of your order. You want to try a load?" Harlan Beamer thought about it for about 15 seconds. "Yeah," he said, "I'll try a load." What happened over the next 6 weeks was not dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It was dramatic in the way that real, durable things become dramatic, slowly, steadily, like a river carving a canyon. You don't hear it happening. And then one day you look down and there's a gorge where there used to be flat ground. Let me take you into that barn on a Tuesday morning in late November 1977. The temperature outside was 12 degrees. The barn was not heated, but the animals, 6 beef cows wintering on the ground floor, put out enough body warmth to keep the interior 15 degrees above ambient. It smelled of straw and corn dust and grease and the particular warm leather smell of cattle. The light came through 2 south-facing windows and a bare 100-watt bulb hanging from the center beam on a wire. Eldon had rigged a grain auger, a 6-inch Westfield model he'd borrowed from his brother-in-law in exchange for a half-cord of firewood, to move corn from the wagon directly into a holding bin he'd constructed from plywood and 2x6s the previous weekend. The bin held approximately 300 bushels. From there, a gravity chute fed into the Roskamp roller mill. The mill, when it ran, made a sound like a very serious machine performing a very specific task. A low, rhythmic grinding, a steady vibration that you felt in the soles of your boots more than heard in your ears. The rollers were set to produce a medium crack, not flour fine, not whole. The cracked corn came out of the discharge chute into burlap sacks that Eldon had purchased from a livestock supply company in Ames. 50-pound bags sewn closed with a hand-operated bag stitcher he'd bought at a farm sale the previous spring for $22. Ruth Ann kept a ledger. This is important. Eldon was not a man who kept precise books. That was Ruth Ann's domain, and she was meticulous. She calculated cost of corn at the day's elevator by price, because Eldon wasn't selling to the elevator, but he needed a cost basis, plus electrical cost to run the mill, plus bag cost, plus his labor time at a figure they agreed to call $4.50 per hour, which was what a decent hired hand made in 1977. The rolled corn they could deliver to Harlan Beamer's operation at $2.55 per hundredweight, versus the mill's $2.85. The margin after all costs was approximately 31 cents per hundredweight delivered. That doesn't sound like much. But Harlan Beamer was running 1,100 finishing hogs and went through approximately 90 hundredweight of rolled grain per week. Ruth Ann did the math on a yellow legal pad, sitting at the kitchen table, the percolator going, a December snow moving in from the northwest and making the windows rattle. She looked at the numbers for a while. Then she said, "Eldon, call the Dutchman place." The Dutchman place was a 600-head dairy operation. They had been quietly dissatisfied with the Iowa Falls mill for 2 years, delivery delays, a quality issue in the summer of 1976 that nobody had been able to explain. Eldon called Harold Dutchman on a Thursday evening. By Saturday, he was delivering a trial load. 2 weeks later, Harold Dutchman called him back and asked if he could be a regular supplier. By Christmas of 1977, Eldon had 3 regular customers: Harlan Beamer's hog operation, the Dutchman Dairy, and a smaller hog confinement run by a man named Vern Witt who lived on a county road north of Hubbard. He was running the Roskamp mill 3 days a week, 4 hours per session, moving approximately 1,800 bushels of his own corn per month. But here's where it gets interesting, and I want you to pay close attention to this. Because Eldon's own 2,200 bushels were going to run out. It was Ruth Ann, sitting with that yellow legal pad at the kitchen table, who saw the next step first. She looked at the numbers and said, "If we're making margin on processing and delivery, we don't need to grow all the corn ourselves. We could buy corn from other small farmers who also can't get their loads accepted. Bring it here, roll it, deliver it." She let that sit for a moment. "We'd be our own mill," she said, "just a different kind." Eldon looked at her for a long time. "Who taught you economics?" he said. She pointed at the legal pad. "Let me pause here and ask you something. How many times have you seen a door close and assumed the story was over? How many times in your own life or in the lives of people you know has a rejection, a no, a door slammed in cold weather, turned out to be the thing that forced someone towards something better? The Kellerton Co-op rejected 2,200 bushels of wet corn. And in doing so, they forced a man to stop being a commodity producer, a man who grew something and then handed it to somebody else to determine the value of and start being something else entirely. Stay with me, because in the spring of 1978, things are about to get very interesting. By February of 1978, Eldon had made contact with 4 other small farmers in the county, men who had similar stories, similar wet corn rejections, similar frustrating experiences with the Kellerton Co-op's moisture standards and the Iowa Falls Mill's pricing. He wasn't formal about it. He didn't call a meeting. He visited each one at their farm in the evening and had a conversation over coffee. The proposition was simple: sell your off-spec corn to me at a price I'll tell you right now before you deliver. I'll roll it and sell it. You get a guaranteed price and you don't have to deal with Pruitt. 3 of the 4 said yes. By April 1978, Eldon was sourcing corn from 5 farms, running the Roskamp mill 5 days a week, and servicing 11 regular livestock accounts across a 20-mile radius. He'd purchased a used 1972 International Lodestar flatbed, the same model Gerald Foss drove, which was either irony or symbolism depending on your disposition, for $3,200 cash, paid from his first 4 months of processing revenue. Ruth Ann's ledger showed net profit for the first quarter of 1978 at just over $4,100. That was more than Eldon had cleared from his entire corn crop the previous year. And not one bushel of it had passed through the Kellerton Grain Co-op. The moment of reckoning, when it came, was not a single dramatic confrontation. Life is rarely that neat. But there was a moment, a specific, witnessed, crystalline moment that people in Hardin County would still talk about years later. It was a Saturday morning in June of 1978 at the Hardin County Farm Bureau annual field day, held on a large operation east of Eldora. About 200 farmers, equipment dealers, and county officials attended. There were equipment demonstrations, a lunch put on by the local women's organization, and the usual informal networking that happened whenever farmers gathered in numbers. Eldon was there because a farmer named Chet Alderman, who ran 440 acres and a 300-head hog operation, had asked him to come talk about the rolling service. Chet was thinking about becoming a customer. Dale Pruitt was there. Gerald Foss was there, wearing clean boots with the decorative stitching, his Lincoln parked prominently in the field lot. Foss saw Eldon arriving and made the mistake of doing what comfortable men with short memories often do. He assumed the dynamic between them hadn't changed since November. "Marsh," he said loud enough to carry in a cluster of men near the equipment line. "You still rolling that wet corn in your barn? Heard you were trying to set up some kind of little feed operation." He said little the way people say "bless your heart." It was the word that carried the contempt, not the sentence. There was a ripple of attention among the men nearby. Small county social physics. Eldon looked at Gerald Foss, then he looked around at the faces watching. 14 accounts now," he said quietly. Moved about 28,000 bushels since November. Made more clear last quarter than I did off 280 acres of corn in 76. He didn't say it loudly, he didn't have to. The man next to Foss, a farmer named Ray Osterman who ran a large hog confinement, turned to look at Foss with a different expression than he'd been wearing a moment before. Ray Osterman had been paying the Iowa Falls mill for 12 years. "You delivering to new accounts?" Ray Osterman asked Eldon. "Yes," Eldon said. Dale Pruitt, standing 20 feet away, was very quiet. Gerald Foss said something. People remembered it differently later, but whatever it was, nobody laughed at it this time. And Foss seemed to understand, in the way that men with social instincts understand things before their minds catch up, that the room had shifted. Eldon Marsh shook Ray Osterman's hand, talked to him for 4 minutes, and booked a trial delivery the following Thursday. He drove home in his 1972 International Lodestar. The silence behind him in that field was not the silence of contempt, it was the silence of recalibration, of men doing arithmetic. Let me tell you what the years looked like after that. By the end of 1978, Eldon Marsh's Marsh Farm Processing, Ruth Ann named it out of stubbornness. She said it should have a name if it was a business, was servicing 22 accounts across Hardin and Franklin counties. He had added a second roller mill, a used Roskamp 2-roll machine he purchased from a retiring feed mill operator in Hampton, Iowa for $2,100. He'd hired a part-time driver, a young man from Eldora named Kevin Paulson, who was saving money to start his own operation and worked for Eldon 3 days a week. The 1978 revenue from processing and delivery, separate from the farm's crop income, was $31,400. The net, after cost of corn, equipment, labor, and fuel, was $11,800. In 1977, the Marsh family's total net farm income had been $8,200. They had more than doubled it in a single year without adding an acre of ground. Ruth Ann opened a separate business checking account at the Iowa State Bank in Eldora. She kept the ledger going. She added columns. She started tracking accounts receivable, delivery costs per route, profit per hundredweight by account type, dairy versus hog versus cattle. She had a gift for this that nobody had needed before, because before there hadn't been anything complex enough to require it. Now there was. In 1979, Eldon made an investment that raised eyebrows again. He purchased a used grain dryer, a 1974 Farm Fans Ob 150, from an auction in Grundy County for $4,800. It was gas-fired, with a capacity to dry approximately 450 bushels per hour from 22% down to 14% moisture. This meant he could now accept wet corn from other farmers, the same wet corn the Kellerton elevator rejected, dry it himself, and either process it through the mill or resell it at dry corn prices. He was, in the language of modern business, creating a vertically integrated operation. But in 1979 in Hardin County, Iowa, nobody called it that. They called it Marsh's Place, and they drove their rejected corn there because he paid them fairly and didn't make them feel stupid. By 1980, when the farm financial crisis that had been building for years finally broke open across the Midwest, interest rates climbing past 18%, land values beginning their catastrophic correction, farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values suddenly underwater, Eldon Marsh was in a different position than most of his neighbors. He had diversified income. He had minimal debt because he'd been paying cash for equipment from processing revenue rather than borrowing. He had 22 loyal accounts that needed feed regardless of what commodity prices did. And he owned his 280 acres free and clear by 1981, paid off the federal land bank loan 6 years early. Gerald Foss was not so fortunate. He had borrowed heavily in the late 1970s to expand his operation to nearly 1,400 acres, financing it against land values that peaked in 1980 and then fell 40% over the following 3 years. By 1983, he was in workout discussions with the Farmers' Home Administration. By 1985, he had sold 600 acres, including, in a detail that people in Hardin County noted without saying much about it, approximately 140 acres to a neighbor at a price meaningfully below what he'd paid. The Kellerton Grain Co-Op underwent a management change in 1981. Dale Pruitt took early retirement. The The new manager, a younger man named Tom Grief who had come from a co-op in Wright County, actually reached out to Eldon about a working relationship. Eldon thought about it for several days. He declined politely. Kevin Paulson, the young man who'd driven for Eldon 3 days a week starting in 1978, saved enough money to lease 160 acres in 1982. Eldon sold him corn for processing at cost for the first 2 years. Kevin Paulson is still farming in Hardin County today. In 1984, Eldon and Ruth Ann's eldest son, David, came home from Iowa State with an agronomy degree and joined the operation. He brought with him knowledge of newer feed supplement systems and connections with university extension specialists who were doing research on feed efficiency in confinement livestock. Marsh Farm Processing added custom supplement mixing to its services in 1985, a second-generation building on the foundation Eldon had built with stubbornness and a second-hand roller mill. By 1988, the operation was processing roughly 180,000 bushels of grain annually through the mill and moving product to 41 accounts in 3 counties. Revenue had grown to something that would have been incomprehensible to the man who'd sat in a frozen truck in November 1977 and read a rejection slip for the second time. Ruth Ann's yellow legal pad had long since been replaced by a compact computer with a spreadsheet program, but she kept the original pad in the drawer of the kitchen desk. She could tell you the exact figures from that first month without looking it up. Let me tell you what I think this story is really about. It's not about a smart farmer who outsmarted a crooked elevator man. Pruitt wasn't particularly crooked, just petty, and petty is common enough. It's not even, ultimately, about the business. The business was a consequence, not the point. The point is something older than farming. It's something so old it belongs to the very earliest human understanding of adversity. The obstacle is sometimes the door. Eldon Marsh had been selling commodity corn for 20 years, growing it, hauling it, handing it over, accepting whatever price the man behind the glass gave him and going home. That is not a criticism. That is what millions of American farmers did because that was the system, and most of the time it worked well enough. The system wasn't malicious. It just didn't care about you individually. The rejection slip, that folded piece of paper Eldon kept in his breast pocket, forced him to stop participating in a system that didn't care about him and start building a smaller, closer, more personal system that did. A system where he knew his customers by name, where he knew what their hogs ate and what their dairy cows produced and when their deliveries needed to arrive, where value was created by relationships and reliability, not just by the commodity price on the Chicago Board of Trade. Let me pause here and ask you something as we come to the end of this story. How many of us are waiting for someone else's system to recognize our value? How many of us are hauling our harvest to a window, a literal window or a figurative one, and waiting for the person behind the glass to tell us what we're worth? Eldon Marsh was 43 years old when he drove away from that elevator. He wasn't young, he wasn't starting out. The conventional wisdom would have said his choices were already made, his path already set. He was a corn farmer, that's what he did, that's what he'd always done. But he drove home and looked at a roller mill that everyone else had called a paperweight, and he thought, what does this make possible that I haven't tried yet? That is, I believe, the whole of the lesson. Not patience exactly, though patience was required. Not defiance exactly, though defiance played its part. The lesson is about not letting the categories other people put you in determine what you actually do. A grain elevator refused his harvest. A banker's son laughed at him in a frozen parking lot. A big farmer told him he should sell out at an insult price and go home. And Eldon Marsh, 43 years old, with a used roller mill and a wife who kept a yellow legal pad, built something better than any of them had thought to imagine. Quietly, without making a speech about it. One account at a time, one delivery at a time, 1 week at a time, through Iowa winters and spring mud and the long hard years that broke 1,000 other men. There's an old saying in farm country, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago and the second best time is today. Eldon didn't have 20 years. He had a rejection slip and a frozen November morning and a barn full of wet corn that nobody wanted. He planted something anyway. And the roots went deep. Historical context is real. Roskemp Champion roller mills, farm fans grain dryers, international harvester combines, and on-farm grain processing practices described in this video are accurate to the era. The farm financial crisis of the early 1980s affected hundreds of thousands of American farm families. Characters, names, dialogue, and specific events are dramatized for storytelling purposes. Subscribe to The Forgotten Farmer for new stories every week. If you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it.